I'm very happy to present the next guest. And this is John Whittingdale. He comes from the British Parliament. I'm very pleased to introduce him, not only because I've known him for over 7 years. I'm also happy to introduce him because he has been one of the strongest advocates of Ukraine in the United Kingdom. And we really appreciate that. He's chairing the All-Party Group on Ukraine. It is an equivalent of the Ukrainian caucus in the United States of America, who are more familiar with that concept. John has been in the parliament for a very long time, but he started his political career as a private secretary to Margaret Thatcher, who's very much loved in Ukraine. And currently he's chairing a committee on media and culture in the British Parliament. So, John, without much further ado, the floor is yours.
Vasyl, thank you very much for your invitation to come this afternoon. I have been in Kiev for the past 3 days with 7 of my colleagues from the British Parliament. We have had 4 Conservative members of Parliament, 4 Labour, and I'm the only one who had been to Kiev before. So we have been, I suppose, as an educational trip for those to hear at first hand what's been happening. But as Vasyl said, I have been chairman of the British Ukraine group in Parliament in the United Kingdom for the past 4 years. And we started by being very supportive of the ambitions of Ukraine to sign the association agreement with the European Union. And I had many talks with your government about how we could promote that and win support in Europe for Ukraine to become associated. Obviously, we were very concerned when President Yanukovych suddenly reversed that policy overnight. And then we watched with mounting distress the events that followed in the Maidan. And I did my best to raise awareness in Britain of the extraordinary courage being shown by the protesters who were camped there, and also the dreadful abuses of human rights that took place in the Maidan. And we are still very conscious of the sacrifice made. Following the change of government, we have obviously become even more concerned at the actions of Russia. And we have made it clear that we regard the annexation of Crimea as completely unacceptable, and we are strongly supporting very tough sanctions against Russia to demonstrate that this cannot be tolerated in a modern Europe. The purpose of our visit has been very much to talk to leading Ukrainian politicians about the present situation and what we can do to assist. And we've been very fortunate. We have had meetings with Mr. Poroshenko on Monday. We have met Mr. Groisman, the Deputy Prime Minister, this morning. We have travelled to Odessa. We've had meetings with a number of members of the Rada, and we've met members of civil society and different activists. So I think that my colleagues go back with a much greater understanding of the situation in Ukraine, but also with a determination that we will go back to our government and make the case as to why Ukraine needs our help now. And we will be pressing for stronger measures. We wait to see what happens in Geneva, but so far the signs are not promising. And if the Geneva talks fail, then there is plainly a very strong case for tougher measures to be imposed on the Russian administration. And I believe that my country is determined to do that, and we will be arguing for that across Europe. So that is really all I would like to say, but obviously I'm very happy to answer any questions you have.
Hi, Jamie Detmer, Daily Beast and Voice of America. You mentioned you may be recommending tougher measures. Can you kind of lay out what kind of tougher measures, and would that include sanctioning Russian companies using the City of London and the financial system in the UK? Secondly, you also talking about providing more help to the Ukrainian government. Would that include any military help or intelligence sharing as well?
We've talked about both those things while we've been here. In terms of sanctions, there are 2 challenges. The first is that sanctions are only really effective if you can obtain international agreement. There's no point in our closing the City of London if money moves to Frankfurt. So it is going to be much more agreement across the European Union, and that's something we will continue to press for. But in terms of what measures could be taken, in particular, we were advised that there is evidence to suggest certain Russian banks have been directly involved in the financing of separatist occupations in eastern Ukraine. If the evidence is there to support that, then that clearly would, in my view, justify taking action not just against individuals, but also against Russian financial institutions. But it is important that it should be based on evidence, because if the British Parliament and other parliaments are to impose measures, they have to be capable of defending against legal challenge. There is no doubt that Russia will try to challenge any measures in the courts if it thinks it is possible. So we need to have evidence, but we've been talking to members of the administration in Ukraine about what evidence there is, and certainly in my view there is now a strong case for taking action against Russian financial institutions. In terms of your other question about military support, again we have talked about that. I think there is a case for our providing assistance in terms of things like communications equipment, body armor, uniforms. We're told that the Ukrainian army is very ill-equipped. It needs new provisions, and that is the sort of thing which I think we could well now move to supply. I think it is unrealistic to think we would field troops in Ukraine, but we can obviously do a lot short of that in terms of intelligence sharing, in terms of providing munitions, equipment that is needed. And that is certainly something which I hope we will look at.
Dmytro Shenkrug, Ukrainian National News. Because the United Kingdom was one of the countries which signed Budapest Memorandum. And actually you mentioned only like equipment. For example, the president of Freedom House suggests that USA should supply some arms, weapons for to protect the country. Will Britain make any supplies of this kind?
I think at the moment we are talking principally about such things as I mentioned, like uniforms, like communications equipment. We were told in our discussions that actually is what is most needed by the Ukrainian armed forces. The Budapest Memorandum, we are very conscious that we were signatories, as was the United States, but the memorandum does not actually commit the signatories to provide military intervention in the event of a breach. But nevertheless, what Russia has done is not just a breach of the Budapest Memorandum, it's a breach of international law, it's a breach of the European Convention of Human Rights, the UN Charter. There is no question that what Russia has done is completely illegal in international terms, and therefore they have to be, it has to be demonstrated to them that this is unacceptable, particularly in the center of Europe. So I believe that we do have an obligation to provide support, but I have to be realistic. I think it is unlikely that the British or Western governments would actually support military intervention, and that is something that my government has said and made clear.
John, I would like to praise the role of Britain in this particular crisis, because I believe Great Britain is leading leading this process in Europe, because what Britain has done, many other EU countries have been actually very slow, and it's really great that you are a driver of this whole process. However, we have still major problems with a number of countries, and their governments are not very, they do not respond on time, or they actually have some other sort of agendas as well. And they, in many different respects, were manipulated by the Russian propaganda, which was massive, and you probably see it in the UK as well. But it's been massive all over Europe and in the US. So people don't really have an in-depth understanding of what's going on. Many believe that the truth is somewhere in between what Russia say and others say. But in fact, is black and white, is true and false. So I wonder if you, I mean, and this is sort of a request for you, maybe you could also communicate with your colleagues in Bundestag, with your colleagues in the Dutch Parliament, with the colleagues in Spanish Parliament, in Italian Parliament, because we really need that these 4 countries, particularly that I've pointed out, this is where our positions are the weakest of Ukraine, and I wonder if there may be some other forums which you, as a member of parliament, you think you could sort of use. Maybe you could talk to your delegation in the Council of Europe, for instance, because they interact with those MPs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There are 2 problems here. There is Russian propaganda, which is very effective, not just in terms of what people in eastern Ukraine watch on their televisions, but also in terms of West, and we are subject to the same propaganda that the government of Ukraine is now illegitimate, that it's made up of fascists and extremists. So it's clearly important that we counter that. But there is also a simplistic understanding of Ukraine in the Western media, because you have people who are not familiar. You know, they've suddenly been given this huge story, having not had a great understanding. So, for instance, if you read the press in Britain and elsewhere, you know, it is, a lot of people will write Western Ukraine is pro-Europe, Eastern Ukraine is pro-Russia. Now, plainly, that is not the case. It's much, much more complicated than that. But that, you know, one of the brought 7 of my colleagues from Parliament was actually to ensure that they had a proper understanding of the reality of the situation in Ukraine. And we will go back to talk about that. And you're absolutely right that it isn't just in the British Parliament that we need to do that. It is in other parliaments. We recognise that a country like Germany has very strong economic ties with Russia. But I can tell you that David Cameron, my Prime Minister, is in very regular contact with Angela Merkel in Germany, and you know, there is a determination across Europe, I think, to take tougher measures. And we also acted in the Council of Europe. The British Conservative Party, through rather strange circumstances, for a time sat in the same group as United Russia in the Council of Europe. We have left, we have expelled United Russia, and actually we have suggested that Russia's behavior disqualifies it from membership of the Council of Europe. It is in such clear breach of every principle of the Council of Europe. So that is another forum, absolutely, where we are making a very strong case against Russia and pointing out that what they have done is illegal and unacceptable.
Thank you. This morning I had the privilege to meet your Minister of State for Justice, Simon Hughes. And among many other things that we have discussed, we talked about actually the contribution of Great Britain to solving a number of issues in Ukraine, including the rule of law, the independent judiciary, curbing corruption, and I was very pleased to hear that the British government intends to support Ukraine and provide assistance and funding for that purpose. So that's really great. But another thing that we also discussed was actually leadership programs for the younger people in Ukraine. And maybe you as a parliamentarian could also support that, because, for instance, I'm a tuning scholar, but you know, only 5 scholarships are awarded to Ukrainians this year. We need at least 15 for next year. And maybe you could help us in terms of getting more funding for tuning and for other leadership programs which could be awarded to the Ukrainians.
I would very strongly support that. There are ways. I mean, I think obviously all attention at the moment is on the present crisis in terms of the threat from Russia. But even if we overcome that, the challenges facing Ukraine are immense. And I've been encouraged in the conversations I've had with Mr. Poroshenko and others about, you know, their determination to eliminate corruption, to try and install a proper independent judicial system. We talked to Mr. Grossman this morning also about that. And those are things which we can help with. Britain is fortunate that we have had a very long system of independent judiciary, human rights, dating back to Magna Carta, which we will celebrate next year, the 800th anniversary of the signature of Magna Carta in Britain. And those are areas where we can help. And I know already that judges from Britain are coming out to talk to their Ukrainian equivalents about how a proper independent judicial system should work. And sparing Vessel's blushes, I've always been hugely impressed by the caliber of people who have undergone or had the opportunity to take achieving scholarships, or even the John Smith Fellowship, which is just a very brief program. But there is no question that Ukraine needs a new generation of leaders, and if we can help by giving them the opportunity to work with politicians in Britain or in America or wherever, then that has to be not just a benefit to Ukraine, but actually to benefit to us as well. So I will certainly be arguing that that's a way in which I think, at relatively little cost, we can.
If you don't mind, do you have a question? No? I can just, because if you have questions, just let me know, because yeah. I just want to, this is a little bit more complicated. It's on energy issues. As you know, a number of energy companies have invested into exploration of gas and oil in Ukraine, and there was some major projects going on in the Black Sea Shelf. And one of the British companies, including Shell, has interest in Ukraine, and they've been also working on some deals there. The situation now has actually undermined those projects. And I understand it's a difficult question, but and there is also British Petroleum there, and there are other British energy companies who keep on investing into Russia and Ukraine. And now we're in a very tricky and difficult position. I mean, what would be the role of the British government? How can we sort it out? Because your country is the one that is least dependent on Russia in terms of energy supply, and you're lucky in that respect. And therefore, it would be great if you could step in and help us basically solve that issue with energy, because apart from land grabbing, which Putin done, he's actually grabbed lots of oil and gas.
You're absolutely right. Britain is less dependent on Russia than maybe some other European countries, but nevertheless, what has happened has, I think, raised awareness of the dangers of becoming dependent on a highly unpredictable regime like that of Russia. So even in Britain, we are now actively seeking alternatives. We are developing shale gas fracking. We're obviously in a process of dialogue with Iran, which hopefully may lead to a potential alternative source. In terms of investment into Ukraine, and some of the companies obviously are also investing in Russia, you can understand why at the present time there's going to be some nervousness, but actually the greatest benefit that I think we can offer Western companies is the prospect of Ukraine evolving into a democratic society where there is getting rid of corruption, having confidence that investment will see a return, that there is no risk of suddenly having assets seized or taxes presented. And that actually has been one of the great disincentives to Western companies in Russia and, I have to say, in Ukraine. And I talk to many British companies who have found it very difficult to maintain investment in Ukraine because of the degree of corruption. So actually, even though the present situation is obviously very dangerous, if we can hold out the prospect of a Ukraine which is much closer to a functioning, market-oriented society where the rule of law prevails, that actually is the greatest confidence you can give to investment. And well, one thing about Ukraine, well, one of the many attractions of Ukraine is that the potential here is absolutely vast, not just in energy, but also in agriculture, where potentially you are sitting on enormously valuable assets, which I think would be hugely attractive if you can give investors that confidence.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Ira. It's Ukrainian internet channel Spilno TV, and my question: if Russia will begin the war, what do you think will the Parliament of
actions, we have made it clear that if there is any incursion into Ukrainian territory, particularly along the eastern border of Ukraine, then that will trigger the most severe sanctions against Russia. I think all of the things that we have talked about will be imposed in terms of very, very tough economic sanctions, individual targeted sanctions, and also support all short of actual military intervention. But we need to be very clear, because as several of the people we met said, there's no point in imposing sanctions after it's happened. Actually, the purpose of sanctions is to deter that kind of action, which is why I hope that we will take tougher measures now, particularly if the talks taking place in the next day or so don't succeed. But the message to Russia has got to be very clear. If they put a single military boot over the border, then there will be very severe consequences. And when we were talking this morning, this already represents the biggest military mobilization since the Second World War within Europe. It is an enormously dangerous situation, and it isn't just a threat to Ukraine. We're conscious that Russia's ambitions probably extend beyond Ukraine, and so it is a test of Western resolve, and we have got to make it clear that we will not allow Russia to invade or take action in Ukraine without challenge.
Hi, sorry, one further question. A lot of the near neighbours, NATO neighbours of Ukraine, are accelerating defence programmes and reviewing their defence strategies. Should Britain be doing the same? At the moment you're going through cuts. Should this actually provoke a review of UK defence policy?
Well, I think it's bound to affect the debate. One of the ironies is that for the last 10 years or more, the whole of Britain's defence policy has been changing on the basis that we are never likely to confront a very substantially armed aggressor in the way that we had done during the Cold War. The accepted wisdom had become that it was much more likely to be small states, interventions, terrorism. You know, the days of superpower confrontation were over. Well, I think that the events of the past few weeks have proven that the days of superpower confrontation are not over, and that is bound to affect our defence strategy. And I hope very much that that will be taken into account. It will make us think about whether or not we have been wise to reduce our navy to the extent that we have. And I'm not a military expert, but plainly, the challenge that now exists, for one thing, which I think the events of the last few months have probably put an end to the argument in Britain about whether or not we need to maintain a nuclear deterrent. There were people saying, what is the point of having a nuclear deterrent? It's unthinkable that we would ever come up against a nuclear armed power again. Well, that is no longer the case.
John, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to come here, and we're glad that you've been here for 3 days. You came here in the past for many times, and we really hope to see you back for the elections as perhaps part of the official delegation from the British Parliament to monitor the presidential elections here. So thanks a lot.
I will just finish by saying I chair the British-Ukraine Friendship Group in Parliament. There is a lot of support for Ukraine in Britain. We feel that we have very strong ties, obviously historically, culturally, but also, I have built up a lot of friendships, and I think that I've just come from having a lunch with a number of members of the Rada. Even though Ukraine is a long way from Britain, we feel very strongly for the plight that you face, and we want to give you every support. And that was one of the principal reasons why I wanted to come.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.